One Punch Man Season 3 Episode 11 is actually good. Again, there will always be stiff moments, static and weird shots, especially in the Atomic Samurai fight, but overall I think the episode was good. You can tell that production-wise they upped the quality and had several good animated sequences. I personally enjoyed every fight in this episode and was surprised how they handled some aspects from the manga. As I said, there were flaws, like still sequences that last for too long, like this Atomic Samurai scene and when Zombie Man was burning. And there are like very weird moments like Atomic Samurai's face in this sequence. But nonetheless, this episode opens up with Child Emperor taking Waganma to the surface, and seeing that they didn't have Child Emperor meeting up with Saitama in the previous episodes, they sadly chose to continue with the non-canon version. The only differences here is that Saitama is the one who's supposed to help them to get to the surface, since a monster was blocking the exit and Saitama destroyed him by pushing up. But nonetheless, we after cut to Atomic Samurai facing off against Black S, and subjectively I did like this fight, but objectively speaking it has a lot of problems, specifically regarding the static shots. In this instance they were just too many. Some are not jarring, but this one specifically is pretty weird. However, the way they animated Black S's body changing form and splitting up looked pretty cool, even the sound effect was on point. There's this pretty cool scene where Atomic Samurai is slashing through an army of cells, the animation is sick, and the way it transitioned to him getting surrounded, cutting off the soundtrack was a really good choice. The scene where they jumped him was also pretty good. They used CG, but it didn't look like CG. Black S design wise isn't that complicated of a monster, so CGI would actually work fine on him. This scene can actually compete with the famous JJK jumping scene, only worse where you have hundreds instead of only two. Also, the way they were mocking him after was really funny and adapted well. You can see them moving, and thank god it wasn't a static shot. However, my favorite fight in this episode was Homeless Emperor vs Zombie Man. The sound effect they used for Homeless Emperor's bombs is so on point, and the animation was surprisingly great. This is notable because the previous episode, Zombie Man's movements were sluggish and jarring, but this time Zombie Man looks like Zombie Man. Also, I wanna point out how stupid Zombie Man was in this scene now that I'm looking at it in the anime. He literally warned Homeless Emperor before attacking him. And judging by the monster's reaction, he didn't really expect it. In the manga, I had a different interpretation where it appeared to me that he said it when he was near him already. But no, in the anime, he actually said it before jumping. And knowing what we know about Homeless Emperor later in the story, this was a huge stupid mistake by Zombie Man. But anyways, the impact of when Zombie Man shoots his gun is much more strengthened and apparent, highlighting that these aren't just normal guns. Unlike the previous episodes where these attacks lack strength, the slow motion that indicates Homeless Emperor's reaction speed by defending with a spherical bomb was also on point. We after get insane censorship as always, but we are used to it by this point. I'm going to drop a video tomorrow ranking all executives from weakest to strongest, make sure to tune in. Now, when it comes to one of the most important moments in One Punch Man, which is Homeless Emperor finally encountering this new entity they call God, literally the very first appearance in the manga, what they actually did here is adapt a pre-Ratcon chapter where Homeless Emperor is carrying two plastic bags when this entity finally appears to him. This is literally what we see in the very first version of the manga and the original webcomics. However, the new canon version is indeed brutal, and I do understand the reasons why they refused or didn't want to adapt this one. I think this decision is perfectly healthy, as this isn't just a matter of censorship. Narratively speaking, it still works. However, we do have a different problem in the anime, and I do suspect that manga readers do know that it's a very apparent one. This entity doesn't have a voice actor. In both versions, this character is supposed to be talking to Homeless Emperor, telling him that human beings are fools and he'd be granting him powers. We do get this in the anime, but instead of God talking, Homeless Emperor is the one saying these lines. They did this possibly because they didn't want to waste money and pay a voice actor for saying only 4 lines, which is totally understandable. He's also a character that rarely appears, but at the same time, this is something that people were actually waiting for. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think it's a big deal. But as I said, at the same time, I do understand fans wanting to hear how this character sounds like for the very first time. Personally speaking, I was even afraid that they wouldn't be including this scene at all, since they did remove the moon from Child Emperor's scene, which is something related to that entity, but thankfully they did adapt it with, I would say, one single minor problem. The green aura, also called caught me off guard, but then I did remember that there is this one god colored panel by Murata himself that shows that the character is mostly green. So for now, I don't really have any problems with that. Now, if you are an anime only watcher, I suggest you go read this part in the manga since, as I said, it's a bit different. Understanding the context of this scene is very important to understand the overall story. But overall, I think they did a fantastic job with the god reveal in the anime. The backstory of Homeless Emperor was shaped beautifully. I liked the overlay put on the scene and the OSTs used were on point. Even Homeless Emperor's voice acting was pretty good. In my opinion, this whole scene was fantastic. We have to cut to Puri Puri prisoner scenes and the animation is still surprisingly good. Man, especially this sequence. Where was this when we needed it for important fights? Even when Puri Puri unlocks his vibration ability, the scene was funny and landed well. It did feel like I'm watching an anime. The animation does start to decline after Puri Puri defeats Bakuma, but it's still decent and watchable. Especially when Puri Puri starts chasing Neon, I do think that they did a good job. But again, the neon effects, the many still shots, they always have to be existent. But regardless of all of these, I think this episode does compete with episode 8. Predictions for last episode, so skip here to avoid spoilers. Now, since this episode covered chapters 106 and 107, which was surprising to me since I thought it at least covered 108, the second shortest chapter in One Punch Man. But what they will adapt in the last episode is going to be confusing to follow in the manga. I think they're going to mix between the canon and the pre-retcon version. I suspect they will start the episode with a pre-retcon chapter 114, which contains Pig God vs Gums and goes on to show Iaian finally encountering evil natural water. Only this version unfortunately doesn't have the Narinki squad since they were killed by Amai Mask in the previous episode. This perfectly allows them to minimize the action scenes since the canon version is supposed to be packed with movements, which certainly explains why they made the decision to kill them in episode 10. After that, they will start adapting canon versions, starting with half of chapter 110 since the first half contains the Narinki squad stuff. The second half will have Saitama encountering Rover and punching him, Tatsumaki finally finding Girogiro and easily defeats her, which prompts Girogiro to call for Orochi's help, but he is sadly occupied with an opponent of much higher caliber. This is exactly where they're going to start switching from the pre-retcon to the canon, as I'm not sure if you're aware that this fight contains two versions that are completely different, not only in choreography but also in story. However, according to season 3's opening, it seems like they're going to mix between the two, since it does show the wall carvings that should only be in the canon version, and also at the same time it shows this form of Orochi which should only be in the pre-retcon version. So what they're essentially going to do here, after adapting half of chapter 110, they will switch to the pre-retcon version of this fight, which starts at chapter 108. Yes, I know, very confusing stuff. This will have Orochi transforming to this non-canon form and gives Saitama a good fight. But before he gets killed and defeated, they go much deeper underground, and that's exactly where they will adapt the canon version, which is chapter 112. These things are very important to adapt, and if they don't, you're literally not watching One Punch Man. The Gaia canon, the sacrifice plotline, the god carving reveal, and the moon looking at them all must be covered. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they will be mixing between the two. Now, I think the choices for the cliffhanger in this situation are clear, and if they go for another option, I'd say they're not really understanding the series they're covering. I'd say the best and the perfect choice is to cliffhang the entire scene by ending it with this panel. Knowing what we know in the future, the moon is where God is residing, and this shot right here is indicating that God saw the outcome of Saitama versus Orochi, which is a very important moment. Now, if they go with this option, I think the post-time credit scene will contain Puri Puri prisoner finally finding Garu. Garu in this particular situation is still enchained in the monster's hideout ever since he got defeated by Orochi. The reason I'm considering this is because we literally see this shot in season 3's opening. So they either make this the cliffhanger for this season instead of the god stuff, or have it as a post-time credit scene, which is the best option. Now, final verdicts. I feel like this episode is as good or second to only episode 8. The production was pretty good, a lot of good animated sequences, and you can't generally call this episode anime. Again, compared to modern anime, this would be bad, but compared to season 3, this is actually good. But anyways, if you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and until next time, please take good care.